Everyone deserves a second chance. At least, that's what the old farmer believed. So when 4 Hell's Angels knocked on his door during a deadly blizzard, he didn't see criminals. He saw 4 men who would have frozen to death before morning. So he welcomed them inside, fed them, gave them dry clothes, and offered them a warm place beside his fire. But before the snow finally melted, that one act of kindness would expose a secret buried beneath that farm for more than 30 years. That night, the wind hadn't reached the farmhouse yet. The fire still burned quietly inside the old stone fireplace. The horses rested peacefully in the barn. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing felt out of place. If someone had driven past the farm that evening, they would have seen exactly what they had always seen: a lonely farmhouse, a warm light glowing through the windows, and one old farmer preparing for another quiet night. None of them could have imagined that before sunrise, the entire county would be talking about that same farmhouse, not because of the blizzard, but because of what the melting snow would eventually reveal. If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. We always enjoy seeing this amazing community joining us from all around the world. 3 days earlier, Pine Ridge was the kind of town people rarely left. Not because they couldn't, because they never found a reason to. The roads were narrow, the winters were long, and everyone knew everyone. If a fence collapsed after a storm, 3 neighbors would already be there before the owner noticed. If someone's truck broke down, nobody asked whose responsibility it was. They simply grabbed a toolbox. Life moved slowly there, exactly the way the people liked it. Nearly 5 miles beyond the town limits, past the last mailbox, and beyond the final stretch of paved road, sat a weathered farmhouse surrounded by open fields and towering pine trees. It wasn't the largest property in the valley, but it was the one everyone trusted. Travelers who lost their way knew they could always stop there. Neighbors caught in bad weather knew the porch light would always be on. No one had ever been turned away from that farmhouse. Not once. Keanu Reeves had lived there for almost 12 years. Most people simply called him the old farmer. Nobody knew much about his life before Pine Ridge. Whenever someone asked, he'd smile politely, change the subject, then ask about their family instead. Eventually, people stopped asking. Whatever had brought him to the mountains stayed with him, and Keanu seemed perfectly happy leaving it there. His mornings never changed. Before the sun reached the fields, he fed the horses, checked the chicken coop, walked the fences with Duke, the aging sheepdog who followed him everywhere. Only after every animal had been cared for did Keanu finally sit down with his first cup of coffee. Samuel Turner used to joke that the livestock probably ate better than he did. Keanu would always laugh. They depend on me. I can wait. That afternoon, Samuel's old pickup rolled into the driveway. He climbed out, pulled his coat tighter against the growing wind, and looked toward the dark clouds gathering above the mountains. I've lived here 68 years, he said. I don't like the look of that sky. Keanu followed his gaze. The clouds were moving far too quickly. air had become strangely still. Old farmers noticed things like that, because the land always spoke first. You just had to know how to listen. Keanu stood quietly for another moment, then looked toward the distant mountain road. For reasons he couldn't explain, he had a feeling someone was going to need that porch light long before the storm was over. Samuel looked toward the mountains again. "You think it'll be that bad?" Keanu didn't answer immediately. He simply watched the clouds swallowing the distant peaks, then quietly said, "I think people are going to underestimate it." By late afternoon, the temperature had dropped almost 15 degrees. The wind no longer blew steadily. It came in violent bursts, strong enough to shake old barns and bend the tallest pine trees. The Weather Service issued another warning. All mountain roads closed, travel strongly discouraged. Most people listened. Those who didn't usually regretted it. Back at the farmhouse, Keanu moved with the calm efficiency of someone who had prepared for storms his entire life. He stacked another row of firewood beside the stone fireplace, filled 2 extra water buckets, checked every lantern, made sure the old generator still started on the first pull. Samuel watched with a smile. "You always prepare, like you're expecting company." Keanu shrugged. "You never know." Before leaving, Samuel paused beside his truck. "If you need anything, do you know where I am?" Keanu smiled. "I do." Samuel started the engine, then lowered his window one last time. "And if somebody's foolish enough to be out in this weather, I hope they don't wait too long." Before asking for help, Keanu nodded. "So do I." The pickup disappeared down the snow-covered road. Within minutes, the falling snow erased its tire tracks, as though Samuel had never been there at all. As darkness settled over Pine Ridge, the storm finally arrived. Not gently, it slammed into the valley with frightening force. Snow whipped across the fields so violently, the farmhouse almost disappeared behind a curtain of white. Branches snapped, power flickered, then the entire valley went dark. Only the warm glow from Keanu's lantern still burned beside the front porch. Inside, Duke suddenly lifted his head. His ears stood straight. He walked toward the front door, then quietly growled, not with anger, with attention. Keanu looked over. "What is it?" The old dog never took his eyes off the door. Keanu pulled on his heavy coat, opened the front door. The wind immediately rushed inside. Snow covered the porch. The lantern swayed wildly in the storm. For several seconds, he saw nothing, only darkness, only snow. Then, far beyond the front gate, 4 faint lights appeared, barely visible, moving slowly through the blizzard, disappearing, then reappearing. Keanu narrowed his eyes. Motorcycles. He frowned. Nobody rode motorcycles in weather like this, not unless they had no choice. The lights grew closer. One suddenly disappeared into the snow. Another swerved violently. The remaining 2 slowed immediately. Even from this distance, Keanu could tell they weren't looking for adventure anymore. They were trying to survive. Duke looked up at him, almost waiting. Keanu quietly reached for another lantern, hanging inside the doorway. He lit it, then hung it beside the first. Two lights now cut through the darkness. Small, but impossible to miss. Several minutes later, the sound reached the farmhouse. Motorcycle engines, struggling, coughing, fighting against the storm. Then, silence. The engines had died. Keanu stepped off the porch. The snow already reached halfway up his boots. He walked toward the front gate. The wind howled around him. A figure slowly emerged through the blizzard. Then another, then two more. 4 men, covered in snow, leather jackets frozen solid, their faces hidden beneath layers of ice. One of them could barely remain standing. Another was supporting him with one arm. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Finally, the tallest biker removed his helmet, looked at the old farmer standing alone in the storm, then quietly asked, "We're sorry to bother you, but is there any chance we could warm up here just until this storm passes?" Keanu looked at the 4 exhausted strangers. He noticed the patches stitched onto their jackets. HELLS angels. He didn't say a word. He simply stepped aside, opened the front gate, and motioned toward the farmhouse. "Come inside." None of them realized that the warmest place they'd find that night would also become the last place they ever expected to uncover the truth. "Come inside." None of the 4 bikers moved. Not immediately. For a moment, they simply stood there, snow whipping against their frozen jackets, while they stared at the old farmer holding the gate open. The tallest among them looked over his shoulder, toward the road they had just struggled to leave behind. There wasn't much left to see. The blizzard had already swallowed the tire tracks. The motorcycles were little more than dark shapes buried beneath fresh snow. Another hour, maybe less, and nobody would even know they had been there. The biker slowly turned back toward Keanu. "You know who we are." His voice carried the roughness of someone whose lips had almost frozen shut. Keanu glanced at the patch stitched across the front of his leather vest. "I can read." The man gave a tired smile. Most people would close the door. Keanu looked beyond them, toward the storm tearing across the open fields. I've never known a snowstorm to care what patch a man wears. For the first time since arriving, none of them had an answer. Keanu stepped aside once more. "The wind isn't getting any warmer. You can stand there proving a point, or come inside before one of you freezes." That settled it. The tallest biker gave a small nod to the others. One by one, they walked through the gate. The youngest nearly stumbled as he crossed the porch. His hands shook so violently, he struggled to remove his gloves. Keanu noticed. He quietly opened the front door. "Leave your boots there. The floor's old. It complains enough without snow." One of the bikers let out a short laugh. It surprised even him. It was the first genuine laugh any of them had managed all day. The warmth hit them immediately, not the overwhelming blast of modern heating. The slow, comfortable warmth that only came from a wood-burning stove. The smell of oak logs filled the room. A kettle quietly hissed on the stove. An old clock ticked steadily above the fireplace. Everything about the farmhouse felt lived in. Nothing matched. Nothing looked expensive. But everything had a place. One biker quietly whispered, feels like walking into another lifetime. Keanu hung their soaked coats near the stove. It probably is. The youngest rider rubbed his hands together. I can't feel my fingers. Keanu disappeared into another room. Moments later, he returned carrying 4 thick wool blankets. They're old, but they'll still do their job. Each biker accepted one. Nobody joked. Nobody acted tough. When a man has spent the last 2 hours wondering if he'll survive, pride becomes a luxury. Duke wandered into the room. The old sheepdog carefully sniffed each visitor. The youngest smiled. Guess he approves. Keanu scratched behind Duke's ears. He doesn't waste time judging people. He usually waits to see how they treat him. The tallest biker crouched slowly despite the stiffness in his legs. He held out one gloved hand. Duke sniffed it once, then rested his head against it. The biker smiled. I've always liked dogs. Keanu quietly replied. They're usually good judges of character. The 4 men slowly settled near the fire. Steam began rising from their jackets. The room filled with the smell of melting snow and damp leather. Outside, the wind continued screaming against the windows. Inside, for the first time that day, nobody felt cold. Keanu poured coffee into 5 old mugs. He handed one to each guest. The youngest wrapped both hands around his cup before taking the first sip. His eyes widened. I swear, that's the best coffee I've ever tasted. Keanu smiled faintly. No, it's just the warmest. The room chuckled. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Sometimes silence isn't awkward. Sometimes it's exactly what tired people need. The fire cracked softly. The clock continued ticking. The storm carried on outside, as though the farmhouse didn't exist. Finally, the tallest biker extended his hand. Name's Mason. Keanu shook it. Keanu, one after another. The others introduced themselves. Luke, Eddie, and the youngest, Ben. Ben couldn't have been older than 23, far younger than the others. His leather vest still looked new. His boots hadn't yet learned the shape of his feet. Keanu noticed the difference immediately. First winter ride. Ben smiled sheepishly. That obvious. The others kept saying, we'd beat the storm. Luke laughed. We would have, if Eddie hadn't insisted on stopping for pie. Eddie threw up his hands. It was good pie. Even Mason laughed. For the record, it was. The tension eased a little more. Keanu walked back into the kitchen. A few minutes later, the smell reached the living room. Fresh bread, beef stew, roasted vegetables. Ben looked toward the kitchen. You cooking all that? Keanu nodded. I was. I just didn't know. I'd be cooking for 5. Mason stood. We appreciate it, but we can pay. Keanu shook his head. You can, when the roads open. Tonight, just eat. Mason studied him carefully. You're serious? Keanu looked puzzled. About dinner? No, about helping us. Keanu smiled. I wouldn't have opened the door if I wasn't. The men gathered around the old wooden table. The bowls didn't match. Neither did the spoons. One chair creaked every time someone leaned back. It wasn't perfect. It was real. And somehow, that made the the meal taste better. As they ate, conversation slowly became easier. Luke talked about growing up in Montana. Eddie admitted he'd once wanted to become a mechanic. Ben confessed he still called his mother every Sunday, even though the club teased him for it. Nobody laughed. Instead, Mason quietly smiled. He never misses a Sunday. Ben shrugged. My mom worries. Keanu nodded. That means she loves you. Ben looked down at his bowl. I know. Keanu noticed something else. For men who carried intimidating patches on their backs, they spoke remarkably little about violence. Instead, they talked about motorcycles, roads, engines, broken carburetors, favorite diners, snow, old friends, the ordinary things that make people human. It reminded Keanu of something he'd learned years ago. People were rarely one thing. The world liked simple labels. Life almost never agreed. Dinner finished long after darkness settled outside. Ben stood. I'll wash the dishes. Eddie looked surprised. You hate washing dishes. Ben shrugged. I also hate freezing. I figure I owe the man something. Keanu smiled. You don't owe me. Ben laughed. I'm washing them anyway. As the others talked near the fireplace, Ben quietly carried the empty bowls into the kitchen. He rolled up his sleeves, turned on the tap. The farmhouse creaked softly around him. Old wood always had its own language. He smiled to himself. Then he heard it. A dull, hollow thump. He frowned. It hadn't come from upstairs or outside. It had come from beneath the floor. Ben looked down. The old wooden boards appeared perfectly ordinary. He tapped one lightly with his foot. Solid, then another. Solid, then one near the pantry. Thump, different, hollow. He looked toward the living room. Nobody else seemed to notice. He slowly crouched, ran his fingers across the floorboards. One plank sat ever so slightly higher than the rest, almost impossible to notice, unless you were looking for it. Ben wasn't, but now he couldn't stop looking. He reached toward the edge of the board, just as Duke suddenly walked into the kitchen. The old sheepdog stood between Ben and the floor. His tail wasn't wagging anymore. He wasn't growling either. He simply watched Ben, without blinking. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Keanu's voice came from the living room. Everything all right in there? Ben quickly stood. Yeah. He looked once more at the floor, then back toward the sink, just finishing the dishes. Duke remained exactly where he was, watching, waiting, as though he knew something. Ben didn't. Yet, Ben looked down at the old sheepdog. Duke never barked, never growled. He simply stood there between Ben and the loose floorboard, his cloudy brown eyes fixed on the young biker, as though he understood exactly what had caught his attention. Ben gave an awkward smile. You don't trust me. Duke tilted his head, then slowly sat down, without taking his eyes off him. Keanu stepped into the kitchen, carrying another armful of firewood. You've made a friend. Ben looked relieved. I think he's making sure I don't steal your plates. Keanu smiled. He has good manners. He set the firewood beside the stove and glanced toward the sink. You don't have to wash everything. Ben shrugged. You fed us. Least I can do. Keanu nodded once. I appreciate that. Without another word, he returned to the living room. Duke followed him immediately. Only after the dog disappeared around the corner did Ben quietly glance back toward the floor. The loose board looked exactly as it had before. Ordinary, old, forgettable. He slowly pressed his boot against it again. Thump, definitely hollow. He frowned. Most old farmhouses had crawl spaces. There was probably nothing unusual about it. Still, something about the sound lingered in his mind. Back in the living room, Mason stretched his legs toward the fireplace. I can't remember the last time I was this warm. Luke chuckled. That's because you insist on riding through every snowstorm. I keep telling you, winter doesn't care how tough you think you are. Eddie leaned back in his chair. I told all of you we should have stopped in Pine Ridge. Mason smirked. And sleep where? The motel with one working radiator. Ben walked back into the room, drying his hands on a towel. I would have taken the radiator. Everyone laughed, even Keanu. For a little while, the clubhouse patches disappeared. The motorcycles disappeared. The long highways disappeared. 5 men sat around a fire, talking the way strangers sometimes do when they realize they have nowhere else to be. Luke pointed toward an old black and white photograph hanging above the fireplace. Your family. Keanu looked up. The photograph showed an older man standing beside a weathered barn. A woman smiled beside him. Between them, a little boy, no older than 8, held a puppy in his arms. My parents. Luke smiled. They look happy. They were. Ben noticed there weren't many photographs in the house. Just that one, and another showing a younger Keanu standing beside an old tractor. No wedding pictures. No children. No family gatherings. The walls almost seemed carefully chosen, as though only certain memories had been allowed to remain. Eddie sipped the last of his coffee. You've lived here long. 12 years. You ever get lonely? Keanu smiled faintly. I've learned being alone isn't the same thing as being lonely. The room fell quiet. Mason nodded slowly. There's a difference. There is. Outside, the wind slammed against the farmhouse with renewed force. Snow struck the windows like handfuls of gravel. The lights flickered once, then again. Ben looked toward the glass. I don't think we're leaving tomorrow. Keanu calmly added another log to the fire. I wouldn't plan on it. The old battery-powered radio, sitting on a nearby shelf, suddenly crackled to life. Static filled the room. Then the voice of the county sheriff came through. All residents are advised to remain indoors. Visibility has dropped below 20 feet. Multiple vehicles remain stranded. Search crews have been suspended until daylight. The transmission dissolved back into static. Nobody spoke. The storm had become far worse than any of them had expected. Keanu stood. I've got extra blankets upstairs. You boys can have the bedrooms. Luke immediately shook his head. We're not taking your bed. I wasn't offering it. The room laughed again. I've got an old recliner. It's more comfortable than it looks. Mason frowned. We can't let you do that. Keanu looked genuinely puzzled. Why not? Because it's your house. Keanu smiled. Exactly. My guests sleep in the beds. The conversation ended there. Not because anyone agreed, because Keanu had already made up his mind. A little later, each man carried an old lantern upstairs. The farmhouse creaked beneath their boots. Ben paused halfway down the hallway. Every board seemed to have its own voice. Every door looked older than the one beside it. It was the kind of house that had survived generations. Not because it was beautiful, because somebody had refused to let it fall apart. His room overlooked the northern fields. Snow covered everything. Fence posts, barn roofs, trees, even the old stone well near the edge of the property had almost disappeared beneath drifting snow. The world looked untouched, silent, as though the storm had erased it. Across the hall, Mason quietly knocked on Keanu's door. You awake? Come in. Mason stepped inside. Keanu was folding another blanket. I wanted to thank you. You already did. No, I mean, for not asking questions. Keanu looked at him. What kind of questions? You know, where we're going, where we've been, why we're riding through a blizzard. Keanu smiled. If you wanted me to know, you would have told me. Mason studied him for a moment. You trust people too easily. Keanu shook his head. No, I simply choose not to decide who someone is before they show me. Mason didn't answer immediately. Then he quietly admitted, I wish more people thought like that. As Mason returned to his room, Keanu walked to the bedroom window. The storm showed no sign of stopping. His eyes drifted toward the old barn beyond the house, barely visible through the snow. He stood there longer than necessary, watching, thinking, then quietly closed the curtains. Around midnight, the farmhouse had fallen silent. The fire burned low. The clock downstairs continued its steady rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. Outside, the wind howled across the valley. Ben couldn't sleep. Maybe it was the unfamiliar bed. Maybe it was the storm. Or maybe it was the loose floorboard. He stared at the ceiling for another few minutes, then quietly climbed out of bed, careful not to wake the others. Lantern in hand, he made his way downstairs. The old staircase groaned beneath each step. He paused after every creak, listening. Nothing. The farmhouse remained silent. He entered the kitchen. Moonlight filtered faintly through the frosted window. The floorboards looked exactly as they had before. He crouched beside the one that had sounded hollow, ran his fingers along its edge. There was a tiny gap, no wider than a fingernail, almost impossible to notice. Unless you were searching. He looked over his shoulder. Still nothing. Slowly, very slowly, he slipped the tip of a butter knife into the narrow opening. The board lifted, barely an inch, just enough to reveal darkness beneath. Ben held his breath, then lowered the lantern closer. He expected to see dirt, stone, a crawl space. Instead, he saw the corner of an old wooden chest. His heart began to pound. The chest wasn't buried by accident. Someone had hidden it, very carefully, very deliberately. For a long time, Ben instinctively reached down toward it, then stopped. A floorboard creaked behind him. He froze. Someone else was awake. Ben's heart nearly stopped. The butter knife slipped from his fingers and landed softly on the wooden floor. He quickly lowered the loose floorboard, pushed it back into place, then stood. The lantern cast long shadows across the kitchen walls. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Keanu quietly stepped into the doorway, still wearing the same old flannel shirt, his gray hair slightly untidy from sleep. He looked toward Ben, then toward the kitchen floor. Finally, he smiled. Couldn't sleep. Ben let out the breath he'd been holding. I guess not. Keanu nodded toward the kettle. I usually make tea when the storm keeps me awake. You want some? Ben hesitated, then slowly nodded. I'd like that. Neither man mentioned the floorboard. Neither mentioned the butter knife, still lying beside the pantry. Instead, Keanu calmly filled the old kettle with water, placed it over the stove. The familiar sound of crackling fire slowly filled the silence. Ben finally spoke. You always stay this calm. Keanu smiled faintly. No, I just learned. That panic never solved anything. Ben looked into the fire. I wish I'd learned that. Keanu poured 2 cups of tea, handed one across the table, then quietly asked, How old are you? 23. You've got your whole life to learn. Ben laughed softly. Feels like I've already messed up most of it. Keanu looked at him carefully. What makes you think that? Ben stared into his cup. I wasn't supposed to end up with the club. The words surprised even him. He hadn't planned on saying them. Keanu didn't interrupt. He simply listened. My dad died when I was 14. My mom worked 2 jobs. We barely had enough to keep the lights on. He smiled sadly. The first motorcycle I ever saw belonged to one of the guys. They bought me lunch, helped fix my bike. They treated me like family. He shook his head. I thought I'd finally found where I belonged. Keanu quietly nodded. Sometimes people aren't looking for a gang. They're looking for a family. Ben slowly looked up. Exactly. Outside, the storm slammed against the farmhouse again. The windows rattled violently. The lights flickered once, then darkness. The power had finally gone. Only the fire and the lantern still lit the room. Ben smiled. I guess it's just us now. Keanu looked toward the window. No, the storm's still here. The 2 men sat quietly for another minute. Then Ben finally asked the question that had been sitting inside his mind all evening. Can I ask you something? You just did. Ben laughed. I mean, about the floor. For the first time, Keanu's smile disappeared. Not with anger, with memory. You noticed it. Ben slowly nodded. I wasn't trying to snoop. I know. Silence returned. Finally, Keanu quietly stood, walked to the pantry, kneeled beside the loose floorboard, then carefully lifted it. Ben watched, completely frozen. Keanu reached into the darkness, wrapped both hands around the old wooden chest, slowly lifted it onto the kitchen floor. Dust covered every inch. The brass lock had turned almost black with age. The wood itself carried scratches, as though it had traveled a long way before ever reaching the farmhouse. Ben stared. So, there really is something. Keanu rested one hand on the lid. There always was. You buried it. I hid it. Why? Keanu looked into the fire. Because some things should only be opened when life decides it's time. Ben looked confused. And tonight is that time. Keanu smiled sadly. I think the storm made that decision for me. He reached into his pocket, removed an old brass key. Ben frowned. You've carried that all this time, for 32 years. The answer landed heavily. 32 years, longer than Ben had been alive. The old lock clicked open. Keanu slowly lifted the lid. Inside, there wasn't gold, no stacks of cash, no weapons, only memories, bundles of yellowed letters tied together with faded blue ribbon, a silver pocket watch, several old photographs, a leather journal, and beneath everything else, a neatly folded military uniform. Ben looked surprised. You served? Keanu nodded once. A long time ago. Ben picked up one of the photographs. It showed a much younger Keanu, standing beside another young man, both smiling, both wearing military uniforms, both covered in mud. Who's this? Keanu looked at the picture. For several seconds, he didn't answer. My brother, you said, he died. I'm sorry. So was I. Ben carefully returned the photograph, then noticed something else. Another picture. This one showed the farmhouse, except it looked completely different. Brand new, fresh paint, a young family standing on the porch, children running through the yard. Ben smiled. Your family? Keanu nodded. My parents. There used to be another building. Ben pointed toward the photograph. Right there. Keanu looked. There was. What happened to it? It burned down. When? 30 years ago. The room became quiet again. Ben looked toward the floor, then back at the old photograph, then suddenly remembered the hook, the secret, buried beneath the farm. He slowly asked, Is that what's buried under the house? Keanu didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the chest, removed the leather journal, placed it gently on the table. The cover had cracked with age. The pages had yellowed, but the handwriting inside remained beautifully neat. Ben glanced down. The very first page carried only one sentence. If you're reading this, it means the farm has finally chosen its next keeper. Ben looked up. I don't understand. Keanu quietly smiled. I didn't either. The first time I read it, before Ben could ask another question, Duke suddenly stood. His ears lifted, his eyes locked toward the front door. Not the storm, something else. A moment later, 3 slow knocks echoed through the farmhouse. Knock, knock, knock. Ben frowned. At this hour, every biker upstairs suddenly woke. Footsteps echoed across the second floor. Mason's voice called down. "Keanu, you expecting somebody?" Keanu slowly closed the journal. His calm expression changed. Not to fear, recognition. He quietly looked toward the front door, then whispered, almost to himself, "They found it." The words barely left Keanu's lips, yet somehow they carried more weight than the storm itself. Nobody in the farmhouse moved. The 3 slow knocks had stopped. Outside, the wind continued screaming across the fields. Snow crashed against the windows. The porch lantern swung violently in the darkness. But whoever had knocked didn't knock again. They simply waited. Upstairs, the bedroom doors opened almost at the same time. Mason stepped into the hallway first. Luke appeared behind him. Eddie followed. Ben remained downstairs, still standing beside the open chest. The old journal rested on the kitchen table. Keanu quietly closed its cover, then slid it back into the chest. Not because he wanted to hide it, because now something far more important demanded his attention. Mason slowly walked downstairs. "You expecting someone?" Keanu looked toward the front door. "No." Luke frowned. Then who knocks on a farmhouse? In the middle of a blizzard. Nobody answered, because everyone was wondering the same thing. Another few seconds passed. Then a voice came through the storm. Calm, old, strong enough to be heard. Without shouting, "Keanu, I know you're awake." Every eye turned toward him. Ben frowned. "They know your name." Keanu nodded once. "They do." Mason studied his face carefully. "You know them." Keanu remained silent, not because he was hiding the truth, because he was deciding how much of it needed to be told. The voice came again. "We're freezing out here. Are you really going to leave 2 old men standing in the snow?" Keanu smiled, just slightly, the first genuine smile anyone had seen since the knocking began. He walked toward the door. Luke immediately stepped in front of him. "Hold on. You don't know who's out there." Keanu gently placed a hand on Luke's shoulder. "I do." He opened the door. The blizzard rushed inside. Snow scattered across the wooden floor. Standing on the porch were 2 elderly men, both wearing thick winter coats covered in snow. Neither looked dangerous. One leaned heavily on a walking stick. The other held an old leather satchel beneath his arm. Their faces were weathered by age. Their eyes, by experience. The man with the walking stick smiled. "Took you long enough." Keanu smiled back. "I thought you'd retired." The old man chuckled. "I tried. It didn't suit me." Without another word, Keanu stepped aside. "Come in." The 2 strangers entered the farmhouse, immediately removing their snow-covered hats. The warmth from the fireplace slowly reached them. Ben looked at Mason. Mason looked back. Neither understood what they were watching. The older man noticed the 4 Hell's Angels almost immediately. He raised an eyebrow. "New friends?" Keanu quietly answered. "Guests." The old man nodded. "Good. Still opening your door to people who need it." He removed his gloves, extended his hand toward Mason. "My name's Henry." Mason cautiously shook it. "Mason." Henry smiled. "You've got a firm handshake. My father would have liked that." second visitor remained unusually quiet. He slowly scanned the farmhouse, the fireplace, the windows, the ceiling, almost as though he hadn't been there in many years. Finally, his eyes stopped on the old wooden chest sitting beside the kitchen table. His expression changed, only slightly, but Keanu noticed. "So, you finally opened it." Keanu nodded. "I had to." Henry sighed. "I was afraid this day would come." Ben looked between them. "I'm sorry, but what's going on?" Henry glanced toward Keanu. "You haven't told them." Keanu shook his head. "There hasn't been time." Henry smiled softly. "There never is." He slowly walked toward the fireplace, held both hands near the flames, then looked at the four bikers. "You boys know anything about this farm?" Luke shrugged. "Just that it belongs to him." Henry nodded. "That's what most people think." He looked toward Keanu, then quietly continued. "This farm has never really belonged to any one person." The room became silent. For almost 200 years, every family that lived here was chosen. Ben frowned. "Chosen?" Henry nodded. "The farm chooses its keeper." Eddie exchanged a confused look with Luke. Mason folded his arms. "I don't understand." Henry smiled. "Neither did I. The first time someone told me." The quiet visitor finally spoke. His voice was low, measured. "You don't inherit this place. You accept responsibility for it." Ben glanced toward the old chest. "Responsibility for what?" Neither man answered immediately. Instead, the quiet visitor slowly walked toward the window. He brushed away the frost with one hand, looked toward the snow-covered fields, then pointed toward a large oak tree standing nearly 100 yards from the farmhouse. "You see that tree?" Everyone nodded. "It wasn't there when I first came here." Ben frowned. "How old are you?" The old man smiled. "Old enough to have planted it." Keanu quietly added, "I planted it with him." Henry looked at Keanu. "You remember why?" "I remember." Ben couldn't help himself. "Will somebody please tell us what's buried under this farm?" The room fell silent again. Even the storm outside seemed quieter. Henry looked toward Keanu. "This is your story." Keanu slowly walked back to the wooden chest, lifted one old photograph from inside, placed it gently on the table. It showed the farmhouse, before the oak tree, before the new barn, before the fences. The land looked almost empty, except for dozens of soldiers, military trucks, medical tents, families carrying children. Ben stared. "What is this?" Keanu rested one hand on the photograph. His eyes never left it. Then he quietly said, 32 years ago, this wasn't a farm. Nobody breathed. It was a refugee camp. Every face in the room changed. Mason slowly leaned closer. "What?" Keanu nodded. "Thousands of people passed through this valley. Families, children, people who had nowhere else to go." Henry quietly continued. "The government closed it. The buildings disappeared. The records disappeared. Most people forgot it ever existed." Ben looked toward the old floor. toward the journal. So the secret? Keanu slowly shook his head. No. He looked directly at Ben. The camp is only part of it. Another long silence filled the farmhouse. Then Keanu quietly finished the sentence. The real secret is who's buried beneath it. Outside, the wind suddenly stopped. Not gradually, instantly. The silence felt unnatural, almost impossible. Duke stood. Every hair along his back rose. He wasn't looking toward the front door anymore. He was staring toward the old barn. Something, or someone, was out there. Duke didn't bark. He never did. Not unless there was no other choice. Instead, the old sheepdog slowly walked toward the front door. His ears stood high, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the porch. The room fell silent. Even Henry noticed. He's seen something. Keanu quietly crossed the room. Not hurried, not afraid. He picked up the old lantern hanging beside the fireplace, lit it, then reached for his heavy winter coat. Mason immediately stood. You're not going out there alone. Keanu looked at him. I won't be. Luke frowned. What does that mean? Keanu simply opened the door. The freezing air rushed inside. Snowflakes drifted across the wooden floor. He stepped onto the porch, lantern in one hand, Duke walking beside him. Without another word, the 4 bikers followed. So did Henry, and the quiet old man carrying the leather satchel. The storm had almost completely disappeared. Only a light snowfall remained. The silence felt strange, almost unnatural, the kind of silence that comes after nature has finished shouting. The lantern cast a warm circle across the snow. Beyond it, everything disappeared into darkness. The old barn stood quietly beneath a blanket of white. The oak tree stretched high into the night sky. Its bare branches barely moved. Ben whispered, I don't like this. Neither did Mason, but neither of them admitted it. Keanu slowly walked toward the barn. Every step left a fresh footprint. The others followed in silence. Nobody wanted to ask why. They simply trusted the old farmer, without really knowing why. As they reached the barn, Duke suddenly stopped. He looked toward the far side of the building, then quietly whined. Keanu walked around the corner. The others followed. Nothing, only snow, until Henry pointed toward the ground. There, fresh footprints, one set, deep. Whoever had made them had been carrying something heavy. The prints didn't lead toward the farmhouse. They led away from it, toward the old oak tree. Nobody spoke. The group followed them. The snow crunched softly beneath their boots. Each footprint remained perfectly preserved, as though whoever had left them wanted them to be found. They stopped beneath the tree. The footprints ended. There were no return tracks, no vehicle marks, nothing, just one old oak, standing alone. Ben looked around. How can footprints just stop? The quiet old visitor slowly knelt. He brushed away the snow with his gloved hand. Beneath it lay an old brass marker, almost completely hidden. Luke frowned. What's that? Henry removed his hat. Nobody understood why, until Keanu quietly did the same. The bikers exchanged confused looks. Ben looked down. The brass plate carried no name, only a date, January 18th, 32 years earlier. Eddie looked toward Keanu. What happened here? For several moments, Keanu couldn't answer. He simply stared at the marker, then quietly said, "It started with a bus." The wind gently moved through the branches, almost as though the tree itself remembered. Henry continued the story. The refugee camp was overflowing. More people arrived every day. Children, families, elderly people. They'd already lost everything. The roads closed. The storm trapped everyone. There wasn't enough food. There wasn't enough medicine. And there wasn't enough time. Ben listened carefully. The old farmer beside him suddenly seemed much older, not because of his age, because of the memories he carried. Keanu looked across the fields. "I was younger then. I volunteered to help." "You were a soldier?" Ben asked. Keanu shook his head. "No, just a farmer." Henry smiled. "He says that now." The quiet visitor finally spoke. He drove supplies through roads that nobody else was willing to drive. He made trip after trip, sometimes alone, sometimes without sleeping. He never asked who people were. He only asked what they needed. Ben looked at Keanu. "So why hide all this?" Keanu's smile faded. "Because that's not the secret." Henry slowly reached into his coat. He removed a folded newspaper. The paper had turned yellow with age. The headline was barely readable. He handed it to Mason. Mason carefully unfolded it. Across the front page, a photograph showed the same valley, covered in snow, emergency vehicles everywhere. The headline read, "Local farmer saves hundreds during historic blizzard." Luke smiled. "So you were a hero?" Keanu quietly shook his head. "No." Henry looked toward the oak tree. The newspaper, never printed. The second page. Ben frowned. What was on it? Henry looked at Keanu. Waiting. Keanu slowly stepped toward the tree, rested one hand against its rough bark, then quietly answered, "After the rescue, we started counting people." His voice became softer, almost difficult to hear. One little girl was missing. The bikers looked at one another. Nobody interrupted. We searched for 3 days. Nothing. We searched another week. Still nothing. Henry lowered his eyes. Then the snow melted. Silence. Ben felt a chill. That had nothing to do with the weather. "What did you find?" Keanu closed his eyes for just a moment, then opened them again. A tunnel. Nobody spoke. Beneath this farm. The words seemed impossible. "A tunnel," Luke repeated. Keanu nodded. "It wasn't on any map. It shouldn't have existed." Henry quietly added, "But it did. And inside that tunnel." Henry stopped. His voice caught, even after 30 years. The memory still hurt. Keanu finished the sentence for him. "We found names." Ben frowned. "What names?" Keanu looked directly at him. "The names of children who were never supposed to disappear." Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed. The warmth from the lantern suddenly felt very far away. The The quiet visitor slowly looked toward the old barn, then toward Keanu. "They're going to ask you to open it again." Keanu nodded. "I know." Ben frowned. "Open what?" Keanu didn't answer. Instead, he looked toward the barn, hidden beneath decades of hay, old timber, and silence. Somewhere beneath it lay the entrance to the tunnel that nobody outside this valley was ever supposed to find. And by morning, the people coming to this farm would stop at nothing to uncover it. Nobody spoke. The old barn stood quietly beneath the moonlight. Snow covered its weathered roof. The wooden doors creaked gently in the cold wind. To anyone passing by, it looked like nothing more than another forgotten farm building. But now, every person standing there looked at it differently. Not because the barn had changed, because they had. Ben finally broke the silence. "So, there's really a tunnel under there?" Keanu nodded once. "There is." Luke looked confused. "Why would somebody build one?" Henry answered before Keanu could. "Because 32 years ago, people weren't hiding from snow. They were hiding from men." The words settled heavily over the group. The tunnel connected the camp to the old church beyond the ridge. Henry pointed toward the distant hills. It was built so women and children could escape if the camp was ever attacked. Eddie frowned. "So what happened?" Keanu looked toward the oak tree. "We evacuated hundreds. But during the storm, communication collapsed. People became separated. Records disappeared. And when the government finally closed the camp, they sealed everything." Ben slowly looked down at the brass marker beneath the snow. "So they just left it?" "No," Keanu answered quietly. "They buried it." Silence returned. Henry looked toward the farmhouse. The officials believed, if nobody remembered, the mistakes, they'd never be repeated. He shook his head. They were wrong. Keanu slowly began walking toward the barn. The others followed. Nobody questioned him anymore. Not because they understood, because they trusted him. The heavy barn doors groaned as Keanu pushed them open. Dust floated through the lantern light. Old tools hung neatly along one wall. Horse stalls stood empty. The smell of aged timber filled the air. Everything appeared ordinary, exactly the way Keanu intended. He walked to the far corner, moved an old wooden workbench aside, then rolled up a worn section of rubber flooring. Ben's eyes widened. Beneath it was a square iron hatch. Its surface had almost disappeared beneath decades of dust. Luke whispered, "My God." Keanu reached into his pocket, pulled out another old brass key, different from the one that had opened the chest. He inserted it into the lock. For a moment, he simply rested his hand there, as though saying goodbye to something. Then he turned the key. The old mechanism clicked. The hatch slowly lifted. A rush of cold air escaped from below. Not the fresh air of winter, the stale air of a place untouched. For decades, Ben raised the lantern. Stone steps disappeared into darkness. Nobody could see the bottom. Henry quietly removed his hat. "I never thought I'd see this open again." Keanu looked at the group. "You don't have to come," Mason answered immediately. We're already here. One by one, they descended. The stone staircase creaked beneath their weight. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness. The tunnel stretched farther than anyone expected. Its walls were reinforced with old timber. Faded lantern hooks still lined the passage. Small arrows had been carved into the beams, pointing deeper underground. Ben ran his hand across one wall. Children had carved names into the wood. Tiny initials, simple drawings, hearts, dates. Someone had even scratched the height of a child year after year. The tunnel wasn't just an escape route. People had lived here, waited here, prayed here. Nobody spoke. The silence felt sacred. After several minutes, the passage widened into a large underground chamber. Rows of old wooden bunks lined the walls. Blankets had long since turned to dust. An old medical table still stood in one corner. Shelves filled with rusted food tins remained untouched. Time itself seemed to have stopped. Ben slowly turned in a circle. This is unbelievable. Henry quietly smiled. No, it's unforgettable. Keanu walked toward the center of the room. There, resting on a stone pedestal, was a large leather-bound ledger, protected inside a glass case, untouched, exactly where he'd left it 32 years earlier. Ben frowned. What's that? Keanu gently opened the case, lifted out the ledger. The leather had cracked with age, yet every page remained perfectly preserved. He carefully opened it. Thousands of names, families, children, birth dates, medical notes, every person who had passed through the camp, every life, recorded by hand. Henry's voice softened. When the government sealed the camp, they ordered every record destroyed. Keanu nodded. I couldn't do it. So you hid them. I protected them. Ben slowly understood. This isn't treasure. Keanu smiled. No, it's proof. Proof that every one of those people existed. Mason stared at the pages. So that's the secret. Keanu shook his head. Only half of it. He turned to the final page. Unlike the others, it wasn't filled with names. Only one handwritten sentence. No life is ever truly forgotten, as long as someone chooses to remember. Ben quietly looked at Keanu. You wrote that? I did. Why? Keanu slowly closed the book. Because history doesn't disappear. When people bury it, it disappears. When good people stop telling it. For a long moment, nobody said anything. Finally, Mason stepped forward. The same man who had arrived wearing the patch of the Hells Angels held out his hand, not as a biker, as a man. You saved our lives tonight. Keanu shook his hand. I just opened a door. Mason smiled. No, you reminded us. What kind of men? We still have a chance to become. Luke quietly removed the Hells Angels patch from his leather vest. He looked at it for several seconds, then folded it carefully, without anger, without shame, simply as though one chapter of his life had finally ended. Ben followed, then Eddie, finally, Mason. None of them spoke. They didn't need to. Some decisions were louder than words as the first rays of morning sunlight filtered through the tunnel entrance. The storm had finally passed. Outside, the snow-covered fields sparkled beneath a clear blue sky. The world looked brand new. The 4 motorcycles still stood where they'd been abandoned, half buried in snow, waiting just like the men who had ridden them there. Only now, they weren't the same men. Henry looked toward Keanu. "You've carried this secret for 32 years. Aren't you tired?" Keanu smiled toward the sunrise. "I was. What changed?" He looked at the 4 former bikers climbing out of the tunnel, then quietly answered, "Sometimes, all it takes is one act of kindness to remind people who they really are." The old farmer closed the hatch one final time, not to hide the truth, but to protect it until the next generation needed to remember. Because some legacies aren't measured by the land you own or the money you leave behind. They're measured by the strangers who become better people simply because you chose to open your door